The hospital was almost asleep. Fluorescent lights hummed softly above empty corridors. Monitors beeped in distant rooms. A nurse finished her shift, shoulders, heavy hands still smelling faintly of antiseptic and latex. She moved like someone who had learned long ago how to carry exhaustion without showing it. Then the air changed. Security doors locked with a muted thud. Footsteps measured heavy, unmistakably deliberate, echoed down the hall. Not hurried, not confused, controlled. 6 figures in dark uniforms entered the ER. No raised voices, no explanations, just presence. Doctors froze. Administrators straightened instinctively. No one spoke. The team didn't look at the charge nurse. They didn't look at the hospital director. They walked straight toward the woman taking off her badge at the end of a 12-hour shift. One of them stopped, stood at attention, and spoke words that didn't belong in a hospital. "Commander, permission to report." In that moment, silence became heavier than sound, and everything everyone thought they knew shattered. If you're watching this, comment where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. And if you're drawn to stories where truth reveals itself in silence, consider subscribing. Emily Carter had learned long ago how to disappear in plain sight. At St. Mercy Regional Hospital, she was known as reliable, efficient, quiet. The kind of nurse administrators loved because she never caused trouble, and the kind doctors barely noticed because she never demanded credit. She worked the night shift in the ER, where time bent under fluorescent lights, and every hour felt heavier than the last. 12 hours on her feet, sometimes 14, sometimes more if the ambulances kept coming. Her charting was flawless. Her vitals checks were precise. Her hands never shook, even when a patient coded without warning. People mistook that calm for softness. Emily moved through the emergency department with measured steps, her posture straight, even when exhaustion pressed between her shoulder blades. She listened more than she spoke. When she did speak, it was concise, no wasted words, no emotional flair. To some, that made her forgettable. To others, vaguely unsettling. "She's good," one resident once said, "but she keeps her head down." Emily didn't correct him. Tonight, the ER was understaffed. Again, 2 nurses had called out sick. One trauma bay was closed due to equipment maintenance that had been delayed for weeks. The charge nurse, overwhelmed and irritated, snapped orders without looking anyone in the eye. Emily absorbed it all quietly. A drunk driver came in with a fractured femur. A child with an asthma attack followed 10 minutes later. Then, an elderly man with chest pain whose EKG made Emily's jaw tighten just slightly enough to notice if anyone had been watching closely. She flagged the attending physician. "We should prep him for a cath lab consult," she said calmly. The doctor barely glanced at the monitor. "Let's not jump the gun. Get labs first." Emily held his gaze for a second longer than most nurses would. Then she nodded and moved. She always moved. What no one commented on were the details. The way Emily automatically positioned herself with her back to walls. The way she scanned rooms before entering. The way she noted exits, equipment placement, personnel movement, not anxiously but habitually. Muscle memory buried deep. During a brief lull around 2:30 a.m., Emily refilled supplies in Trauma 2. The hum of the ventilation system filled the room. She allowed herself one controlled breath, slow in, slower out. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. She didn't look at it immediately. When she did, it wasn't a message, just a weather alert. Heavy winds approaching from the coast. Possible storm system moving inland faster than predicted. Emily dismissed it and slid the phone back into her pocket. Across the department, Hospital Administrator Richard Harlan stood near the nurses' station, arms crossed, surveying the ER like a man inspecting property rather than people. He was immaculately dressed despite the late hour, his tie perfectly knotted, his expression permanently dissatisfied. He stopped Emily as she passed. "Carter," he said, glancing at her badge. "I've had complaints." Emily stopped. "About what, sir? You're making independent calls," Harlan replied coolly. "That's not your role." Emily met his eyes. Her face remained neutral. "My role is patient safety." Harlan smiled thinly. "Your role is to follow the chain of command." "Yes, sir." She didn't argue. She never did. Arguing created noise. Noise attracted attention. Attention distorted outcomes. Harlan walked away satisfied. Another nurse leaned in close as Emily updated a chart. "You okay?" she whispered. Emily nodded. "I'm fine." She was always fine. Near the end of the shift, an ambulance radio crackled with an incoming report. The EMT's voice was tight-clipped. St. Mercy be advised, one male patient unidentified. Severe trauma, multiple internal injuries. Mechanism unclear. Emily looked up instantly. Vitals unstable, the EMT continued. We're 10 minutes out. The charge nurse sighed. Great, just what we need. Emily was already moving, prepping a bay before being told. She pulled specific equipment without hesitation. Blood warmers, advanced airway tools. She checked medication dosages twice, not because she doubted herself, but because precision mattered. When the gurney burst through the doors, the patient looked nothing like a typical ER intake. His injuries weren't chaotic. They were concentrated, purposeful, shrapnel scars, entry points too clean for a car accident. Emily's eyes tracked everything at once, breathing pattern, skin tone, the angle of his injuries, the way the EMTs deferred slightly as if they knew more than they were saying. This isn't civilian trauma, Emily said quietly. The attending physician frowned. And you know that how I know patterns, Emily replied. The doctor waved her off. Stick to your lane. Emily didn't push. Not yet. As they worked, the patient's blood pressure dropped suddenly. The monitors screamed. The room tightened with panic. We're losing him, someone shouted. Emily stepped in, her voice cutting cleanly through the noise. Increase fluids. Prep for massive transfusion. Now. The attending hesitated. We don't have authorization. If we wait, he dies, Emily said. For a fraction of a second, the room balanced on that decision. Then the doctor nodded sharply. Do it. The patient stabilized barely. Later in the hallway, Harlan was waiting. That was not your call, he said coldly. Emily removed her gloves, her movements controlled. He's alive. Harlan leaned closer. You overstepped. Again. Emily met his gaze, something unspoken passing between them. I did my job. Harlan straightened. You'll hear from HR. Emily nodded once. By 6:47 a.m., her shift was officially over. She changed out of her scrubs, slowly folding them with care. Around her, the hospital began to wake, day staff arriving, night staff fading into invisibility. Emily clipped her badge off and held it for a moment longer than necessary. Outside, the wind had picked up. Somewhere, far above the hospital roof, something heavy moved through the sky. Emily stepped into the hallway, unaware that her quiet night had already set forces in motion that would not be ignored. By the time the morning shift fully took over, the ER felt like a different world, brighter, louder, more confident in its own illusions of control. Fresh scrubs, hot coffee, laughter that came too easily for a place where lives had nearly slipped away just hours earlier. Emily Carter moved through it all like a shadow. She had not gone home. After clocking out, she stayed just beyond the nurse's station, finishing documentation that no one else wanted to touch. The kind that required precision. The kind that created a paper trail. Her hair was pulled back tightly, her face bare of makeup, eyes alert, despite the fatigue pressing behind them. Across the room, Administrator Richard Harlan stood with the attending physician from the night shift. Emily didn't need to hear their words to understand the tone. She recognized that posture. Defensive, self-protective. Blame had already found its direction. Carter, the doctor, said sharply when he noticed her. My office. Now. Emily followed without comment. The office was small, windowless, decorated with framed certifications and a single motivational poster about teamwork. Harlan closed the door himself. You violated protocol, Harlan began. Twice. Emily stood with her hands loosely clasped in front of her. I followed emergency response guidelines. You are not authorized to initiate massive transfusion protocols without approval, the doctor snapped. Emily nodded. Understood. Harlan frowned. Do you understand the liability you exposed this hospital to? I understand the patient survived, Emily replied evenly. The silence that followed was thick and sharp. That attitude, Harlan said finally, is exactly the problem. Emily met his gaze. With respect, sir, my attitude didn't save him. My actions did. Harlan's jaw tightened. You don't get to decide that. Emily said nothing. She never argued when someone had already decided the ending. You'll receive a formal write-up, Harlan continued. Effective, immediately you're removed from trauma assignments pending review. The words landed exactly as intended. Emily nodded once. If that's all. The doctor scoffed. You should be grateful we're not suspending you. Emily turned and walked out. In the hallway, a few nurses watched her go, curiosity flickering in their expressions. No one spoke. No one followed. Emily returned to the locker room and sat on the bench, elbows resting on her knees. For the first time that night, she allowed herself to feel the weight of it, not the reprimand, not the threat to her job, but the familiar ache of watching authority choose comfort over truth. She had seen it before. In different buildings, different uniforms, different stakes. The patient, the unidentified man from earlier, remained in critical condition in the ICU. Emily checked his chart from a terminal she technically no longer had access to. His vitals were holding barely. His injuries were extensive, but he was alive. Alive mattered. Her phone buzzed again. This time it wasn't a weather alert. It was a single message. No name attached. Just coordinates and a timestamp. Emily stared at the screen for a long moment. Then she deleted the message. At 8:15 a.m., a nurse from ICU approached her quietly. "That patient you worked on last night. He keeps asking for you." Emily's brow furrowed. "I'm not assigned to him." "I know," the nurse said. "But he's insistent." Emily hesitated. She glanced toward Harlan's office. The door was closed. 5 minutes, she said. In the ICU, machines hummed softly, rhythmically. The patient lay pale against white sheets, his breathing assisted, his eyes half open. When he saw Emily, something shifted, relief recognition, something deeper than gratitude. "You stayed," he rasped. Emily stepped closer. "You should rest." He swallowed. They'll come." Emily didn't ask who. "I didn't have time to explain," he continued weakly. "You did exactly what you were supposed to." Emily's expression remained composed, but her fingers curled slightly at her side. "Focus on breathing." His grip tightened weakly on the sheet. "They'll ask for you." Before she could respond, the ICU nurse gently ushered her out. As Emily left the unit, the hospital PA system chimed a soft alert, quickly silenced. Security personnel moved with more urgency than usual. A pair of unfamiliar men in dark jackets walked past the front desk, badges clipped but turned inward. Emily noted everything. By mid-morning, the storm warnings had escalated. Wind rattled the windows. The helipad status light on a nearby monitor flickered from green to yellow. Air traffic advisories scrolled across a screen most staff ignored. Emily sat alone in the break room, untouched coffee cooling in front of her. She replayed the night in her mind, not second-guessing her decisions but mapping consequences. She had intervened. She had been seen. She had created ripples. That was the danger of doing the right thing in the wrong place. A junior nurse entered hesitantly. "Emily, yes. They're asking about you at the front desk." "Who is they?" The nurse swallowed. "Security." "And I don't know. They don't look hospital." Emily stood. She straightened her jacket, smoothed her hair, and clipped her badge back on, not because she needed it, but because habits mattered. As she walked toward the front of the hospital, she noticed how people moved out of the way instinctively, not because they recognized authority, but because they felt it without understanding why. The automatic doors slid open. Wind rushed in, sharp and cold. Outside, dark clouds churned low over the city. Somewhere beyond the skyline, the distant thrum of rotors pulsed faintly through the air, easy to dismiss as thunder, unless you knew the difference. Emily stopped just short of the entrance. 2 security guards stood rigidly. Between them was a man in a plain jacket posture, precise eyes scanning with trained efficiency. He looked at Emily, not with confusion, with confirmation. "Miss Carter," he said carefully, "we need you to remain on site." Emily met his gaze, unreadable. On whose authority? The man hesitated for half a second too long. "Federal," he replied. The rotors grew louder. The word federal lingered in the air long after the man said it. Emily Carter didn't flinch. She didn't ask for identification. She didn't look toward the growing knot of curious staff gathering behind the glass doors. She simply nodded once, as if this were an inconvenience rather than a turning point. "Understood," she said. The man stepped aside, giving her space without meaning to. Emily noticed. People who understood authority didn't crowd it. Inside, Administrator Harlan had already been alerted. He appeared from the hallway with forced calm, his smile brittle around the edges. "What's going on here?" he demanded, glancing between Emily and the stranger. "This is a hospital, not a sir," the man interrupted quietly. "This matter is not within your purview." Harlan bristled. "Excuse me." Emily turned slightly enough to acknowledge Harlan without yielding ground. "I'll comply," she said to the man. "But I need clarity. Is the patient stable?" The man hesitated again. "For now." Emily exhaled slowly. "Then take me to him." Harlan's eyes widened. "You are not authorized." Emily looked at him then. Really looked. There was no anger in her expression, no triumph. Just certainty. "He is alive because protocol was followed," she said. "If you want him to stay that way, you'll let me do my job." The man in the jacket nodded. "Agreed." Harlan opened his mouth to protest again, but the words died when two more unfamiliar figures appeared behind the first. Their presence shifted the room, subtle but unmistakable. Conversation stopped. Footsteps slowed. Emily walked past Harlan without another word. The ICU was quieter now, dimmed to encourage rest. The patient's vitals flickered across the monitor, fragile but holding. Emily approached his bedside, her movements efficient, her mind already cataloguing changes since she'd last seen him. His breathing was shallower, his pulse irregular. She leaned closer. "You're not out of danger yet," she said softly. His eyes fluttered open. He tried to speak, failed, then tried again. "They trust you." Emily checked his IV lines. "You don't need to talk. They won't listen to anyone else," he rasped. "Not here." Emily's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. She adjusted his oxygen flow, then stepped back as the ICU nurse approached nervously. "Vitals are trending down," the nurse whispered. "The attending says we should wait." Emily looked at the monitor. The numbers told a story she recognized all too well. "We don't have time," Emily said. The nurse hesitated. "HR said you're not cleared. Then HR can write another report," Emily replied calmly. "Prep for intervention." The nurse swallowed, then nodded. Minutes later, the attending physician arrived, irritation etched across his face. "What's going on?" he demanded. "Who authorized this?" "I did," Emily said. "You're not on trauma duty." Emily met his gaze steadily. "He's crashing." The doctor glanced at the monitor, then back at Emily. His expression shifted, uncertainty flickering beneath irritation. "We can stabilize and reassess," he said. Emily shook her head. "We stabilize now, or we lose him." Behind them, the man in the jacket observed silently, eyes sharp. The doctor exhaled sharply. "Fine, but this is on you." Emily nodded. "It always is." They worked in focused silence. Orders were given. Medications administered. The patient's body fought back inch by inch. Sweat beaded at Emily's temples, but her hands remained steady. Finally, the monitor leveled. A breath released from the room. The attending stepped back, rubbing his face. That was close. Emily removed her gloves. It didn't have to be. The man in the jacket approached. Commander Emily cut him off with a glance, so subtle most would have missed it. "Not here," she said quietly. He inclined his head, understanding immediately. Understood. Outside the ICU, Harlan waited, his composure unraveling. "You can't keep doing this," he snapped when Emily emerged. "You are undermining this hospital." Emily stopped in front of him. "I am protecting it, by ignoring authority, by honoring responsibility." Harlan laughed humorlessly. "You think saving one patient excuses insubordination?" Emily's eyes hardened. "I think letting someone die to preserve ego is worse." Harlan's face flushed. "You're finished here." Emily studied him for a long moment. Then she reached into her pocket and removed her badge, placing it gently on the counter between them. "If that's the cost," she said, "I accept it." The man in the jacket stiffened slightly but said nothing. Emily turned away and walked toward the locker room. As she changed, the distant sound of rotors grew unmistakable, no longer thunder, no longer wind. The building itself seemed to hum in response. Overhead, the helipad status light flicked from yellow to red, then back again. A nurse burst into the locker room. "Emily, there's a helicopter requesting emergency clearance." Emily paused, her jacket half on. "Medical." The nurse shook her head. "Military." Emily finished zipping her jacket. Outside, the sky had darkened clouds, swirling low and fast. The thump of rotors vibrated through glass and steel. Staff gathered near windows, phones forgotten in hands. Harlan stood rigidly near the entrance, pale now. "What is happening?" he demanded, to no one in particular. The man in the jacket stepped forward. "Sir, you and your staff are to remain inside." "On what grounds?" "National security." Emily stood just behind him, her expression unreadable. The helicopter descended onto the roof with controlled force wind whipping across the entrance. Doors slid open. Figures emerged, dark uniforms, precise movements, unmistakable presence. Inside, the hospital silence fell. Emily took one steady breath. She had done what was right. Again. And now the consequences were no longer hers alone. The helicopter's rotors continued to thunder overhead, but Emily Carter didn't look up. She stood just inside the staff corridor, hands relaxed at her sides, listening not to the noise but to the change it caused. Doors closed too quickly. Voices dropped to whispers. The building held its breath. Administrator Harlan broke first. "This is outrageous," he said, pacing near the nurse's station, his polished shoes squeaking faintly against the floor. "No notice, no coordination. This is a civilian hospital." The man in the plain jacket didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "Sir, the hospital received a patient tied to an active federal operation. Your facility is now part of that operation." Harlan scoffed. Because of a nurse who can't follow protocol, Emily didn't respond. She had learned that some statements didn't deserve oxygen. A hospital security supervisor approached, face tight. "Sir, rooftop security reports 6 armed personnel disembarking. They're requesting access to ICU." Harlan's color drained. "Armed? They're not here for your staff," the man in the jacket said, "unless your staff interferes." Harlan turned sharply toward Emily. "What did you do?" Emily met his gaze, steady and calm. "My job. That's not an answer. It's the only one that matters." Harlan opened his mouth to speak again, then closed it. He glanced around, aware for the first time that the room was no longer his. Authority once assumed had shifted without ceremony. In the ICU, the patient's condition remained fragile. Emily stood at the foot of the bed, watching the monitors rise and fall. The man in the jacket, Agent Collins, she'd finally noticed from a brief badge flash, stood near the door, speaking quietly into an earpiece. "They're en route downstairs," he said. 2 minutes. Emily nodded. "He needs to be kept stable during transport. His left lung won't tolerate sudden pressure changes." Collins paused. "You're sure?" Emily looked at the patient, then back at Collins. "I wouldn't be standing here if I wasn't." Collins nodded once. "Understood." A nurse nearby whispered, "Who are they?" Emily didn't answer. When the ICU doors opened, the temperature in the room seemed to drop. The men who entered moved with controlled economy, weapons secured, eyes scanning. They didn't rush. They didn't hesitate. Each step was deliberate. The lead man assessed the room in seconds. He looked at the patient, then at Emily. "She's the one," he asked Collins. "Yes." The man studied Emily, not suspiciously, but with recognition. A glance that measured capability, not credentials. "We'll need him prepped for secure transport," he said. Emily nodded. "I'll assist." The attending physician bristled. "She's been removed from trauma duty." The man turned slowly to face him. "Doctor, with respect, that decision is no longer relevant." The physician flushed but stepped aside. Emily moved efficiently, giving quiet instructions, adjusting lines, stabilizing equipment. The SEALs followed her lead without question. To the watching staff, it was subtle but unmistakable. They weren't commanding her. They were trusting her. As they prepared to move the patient, Harlan appeared in the doorway, flanked by 2 administrators. "You can't just take him," Harlan insisted. "We have protocols, documentation, liability." The lead SEAL didn't even look at him. "Sir, if you interfere, you will be detained." Harlan's mouth fell open. "This is absurd." Emily turned to him then. "You should step back." Harlan stared at her. "You don't get to tell me. Step back." Emily repeated quietly. Something in her tone made him obey. The gurney rolled out, surrounded by armed escorts. Staff pressed against walls as it passed, eyes wide, fear and awe tangling together. When the doors closed behind them, the ICU felt smaller, emptier. Harlan rounded on Emily. "This ends now," he said. "You're suspended. Effective immediately." Emily reached into her pocket and pulled out the folded write-up he'd issued earlier. She placed it gently on the counter. "I already accepted that. You think this makes you untouchable?" Emily shook her head. "No. I think it makes the truth unavoidable." Harlan leaned closer, lowering his voice. "Whatever you think you are, you're still a nurse in my hospital." Emily met his gaze. "For tonight." She turned and walked away. In the locker room, she changed, slowly, deliberately. She folded her scrubs the same way she always did. Neat, precise, final. Her phone buzzed again. This time she answered. "Yes," she said quietly. A voice on the other end responded low and controlled. Emily listened, her expression unchanged. "I understand," she replied. "I'll remain on site." She ended the call and slipped the phone back into her pocket. Outside, the storm intensified. Rain lashed against the windows. The helicopter lifted off its departure, no less deliberate than its arrival. Emily stepped into the hallway, no badge, no uniform, just herself. As she walked past the nurse's station, a junior nurse stopped her. "Emily, are you in trouble?" Emily considered the question. "No," she said. "I'm exactly where I need to be." The nurse watched her go, confusion giving way to something else, respect perhaps. Down the corridor, Agent Collins waited. "They want to speak with you," he said. Emily nodded. "I assumed they would." He hesitated. "Off the record. Thank you. That patient wouldn't have made it without you." Emily's gaze softened just slightly. He deserved the chance. Collins stepped aside. "They're expecting you." Emily walked toward the secured conference room at the end of the hall, the weight of the night finally settling on her shoulders. Inside that room, answers waited, and outside it a hospital that had underestimated her, prepared to learn the cost of that mistake. The conference room felt colder than the rest of the hospital. Not physically, no one had touched the thermostat, but in the way rooms did when power shifted, and no one was sure who held it anymore. Emily Carter stood near the end of the table, hands loosely clasped, posture straight. Across from her sat 3 men she didn't recognize, suits cut clean, expressions unreadable. Agent Collins stood off to the side, silent. "Before we begin," one of the men said, "we need to be clear. You are not being questioned." Emily nodded. "Understood." "This is a debrief," the man continued. "Voluntary, for now." Emily didn't react to the qualifier. They asked about the patient, about timelines, about decisions. Emily answered precisely, without embellishment. She didn't justify herself. She didn't defend her actions. She stated facts and outcomes, the kind of language that left little room for interpretation. When it was over, the men exchanged brief glances. "You acted within emergency medical standards," one said. "And beyond them." Emily inclined her head slightly. "The situation required it." "Yes," he replied. "It did." They stood. So did she. As the door closed behind them, Collins lingered. "You'll be asked to stay available," he said. "But for now, go home." Emily paused. The hospital. Collins hesitated. "Administration is recalibrating." Emily almost smiled. Almost. The ER had shifted again by the time she walked back through it. Word had spread, though no one knew what the words were. Conversation stopped when she passed. Eyes followed her, some curious, some wary, some suddenly respectful in a way that felt unfamiliar. Administrator Harlan stood at the nurse's station, surrounded by paperwork and tension. He didn't look at Emily as she approached, but she could see it in the way his shoulders stiffened. "I'm heading out," Emily said calmly. "If there's nothing further." Harlan looked up sharply. "You don't get to just leave." Emily waited. "You've been reassigned," he continued, grasping for control. "Administrative review. Effective immediately." Emily nodded. "I expected as much." Harlan's eyes narrowed. "You don't seem concerned." Emily met his gaze. Concern doesn't change outcomes. For a moment, Harlan looked as if he might say more. Then he glanced around, aware of who was watching. He swallowed whatever response he'd planned. "Turn in your access card," he said stiffly. Emily reached into her pocket and placed the card on the counter beside her folded badge. The plastic made a soft, final sound against the laminate. "There," she said. She turned and walked away without waiting for permission. Outside, the rain had eased into a steady drizzle. The parking lot glistened under pale morning light. Emily stood beside her car for a moment, letting the cool air settle her breathing. She was tired in a way that sleep wouldn't fix. At home, she showered, letting the water run hotter than usual. The sound filled the small apartment, drowning out thought. When she stepped out, she noticed the faint bruise forming along her forearm, an unnoticed bump from the night's chaos. She dressed simply. Jeans, a sweater, no uniform, no insignia. Her phone buzzed once on the kitchen counter. A single word appeared on the screen. "Standby." Emily typed back 2 letters. "Copy." The hours that followed were quiet but not peaceful. Emily cleaned, reorganized, prepared meals she didn't eat. She checked the news out of habit, then turned it off. No mention of helicopters. No mention of St. Mercy. Silence was doing its work. By late afternoon, another message came through. "Return to hospital. Do not announce. Emily grabbed her keys. Back at St. Mercy, the atmosphere had cooled further. Staff moved cautiously as if the walls themselves were listening. Emily entered through a side door unnoticed except by a security guard who stiffened when he recognized her. She walked the familiar halls without a badge, without escort. No one stopped her. In the break room, 2 nurses fell silent when she entered. One of them, the junior nurse from earlier, stood awkwardly. "Emily," she said softly. "I heard things." Emily poured herself water. "Hospitals are good at rumors." The nurse hesitated. "Were they?" Military Emily met her eyes. "Does it change how you treat patients?" The nurse shook her head quickly. "No." "Then it doesn't matter," Emily said. She left the room with the same quiet authority she'd always carried, only now it was visible to those who knew how to look. Near the ICU, she paused. The room where the patient had been was empty now, equipment stripped, bed remade. A life had passed through and left no trace except in the people who'd been there to witness it. Emily rested her hand briefly on the doorframe, then moved on. At the far end of the hospital, Agent Collins waited near an unused conference room. "They're finalizing things," he said. "There's tension upstairs." Emily nodded. "There usually is when accountability arrives uninvited." Collins studied her. "You knew this would happen." Emily considered. "I knew it could. You could have avoided it." "Yes," she agreed. "I chose not to." A long pause followed. "You're different from what they expected," Collins said finally. Emily's lips curved faintly. So were they. As evening approached, a subtle shift rippled through the hospital. Administrators moved more urgently. Phones rang and rang again. A closed-door meeting stretched longer than scheduled. Emily sat alone in the conference room, hands folded, eyes closed. Not resting. Centering. When the door finally opened, Harlan entered alone this time. His confidence was gone, replaced by something brittle and uncertain. "They're asking about you," he said. "Officially." Emily opened her eyes. "Then answer honestly." Harlan scoffed weakly. "You think this ends well for me?" Emily stood. "That depends on when you decided to start telling the truth." Harlan stared at her, realizing too late that the ground beneath him had shifted long before the helicopter arrived. Outside, the sound of approaching vehicles echoed faintly. Not rotors this time. Footsteps. The footsteps were unmistakable. Not hurried, not hesitant. Measured, synchronized, carrying the quiet confidence of people who knew exactly where they were going and why. The sound traveled down the corridor like a low drumbeat, drawing attention without demanding it. Emily Carter stood near the conference room doorway as the first group rounded the corner. They weren't in scrubs. They weren't in suits. Dark uniforms. Clean lines. No insignia displayed openly, only subtle markers that spoke volumes to those who understood them. 2 security guards instinctively straightened, then stepped aside without being asked. Administrator Harlan froze. The lead figure stopped a few feet from Emily. He didn't speak immediately. His eyes moved from her face to her posture, then briefly to the space around them, mapping, assessing, confirming. "Miss Carter," he said calmly, "we need a private moment." Emily nodded. "Of course." Harlan stepped forward, forcing a smile. "I'm the hospital administrator. I should be present for any." The man turned to him, expression unchanged. No, it wasn't loud. It wasn't aggressive. It was final. Harlan opened his mouth, then closed it. He took a step back, his authority evaporating in real time. Inside the conference room, the air felt heavier than before. The men positioned themselves without discussion, one near the door, one by the wall, one seated. The lead remained standing. "I'm Captain Reynolds," he said. U.S. Navy. Emily met his gaze. Emily Carter. He studied her for a moment longer than protocol required. "You finished your shift this morning?" "Yes." "And you stayed?" "Yes." Reynolds nodded once. That decision prevented multiple downstream casualties. Emily didn't respond. "The patient you treated," Reynolds continued, "is a senior operator attached to an active mission. His identity was compartmentalized for a reason." "I assumed as much," Emily said. Reynolds' eyebrow lifted slightly. "You assumed correctly." He took a breath. "We're here because your actions triggered a verification process." Emily's expression remained neutral. Verification of what Reynolds met her eyes directly. "Of you." Silence settled over the room. "Your file," he continued, "is extensive." Emily said nothing. "You entered the Navy at 19, Reynolds went on. Advanced faster than projected. Medical training layered onto operational command, multiple deployments, classified commendations. Agent Collins, standing near the wall, watched Emily carefully. "You stepped away from active command 3 years ago," Reynolds said. "No formal retirement, no public reassignment." Emily's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "I chose a different form of service," she said quietly. Reynolds nodded. "So we see." He slid a thin folder across the table. Emily didn't touch it. "Why a civilian hospital?" Reynolds asked. Emily considered the question. "Because people come there when they have no rank, no backup, no protection. That's not an answer most commanders give." Emily met his gaze. "I stopped being most commanders." Another pause. Reynolds finally sat. "Your presence at St. Mercy was unknown to this command." Emily nodded. "Intentionally. And yet Reynolds said when one of ours was bleeding out, you recognized it faster than anyone else in that building." Emily exhaled slowly. "Patterns don't disappear just because uniforms do." Reynolds leaned forward slightly. "The SEAL team that arrived this morning requested you by name." Emily's eyes flicked up. "They shouldn't have." "They did," Reynolds replied. "They addressed you." As Emily raised a hand, stopping him. "Not here," she said quietly. Reynolds studied her for a moment, then inclined his head. "Understood." Outside the conference room, staff clustered in uneasy silence. Rumors had grown teeth. Phones buzzed with half-truths and speculation. No one knew what to believe, only that the hospital no longer felt like neutral ground. Administrator Harlan paced near the nurse's station, sweat visible along his hairline. Every few seconds he glanced toward the closed conference room door, as if expecting it to explode open. Inside, Reynolds closed the folder. "Commander Carter," he said, calmly, deliberately. Emily didn't correct him. "Your operational authority is still recognized," Reynolds continued. "Dormant, but intact." Emily's expression didn't change, but something shifted in the room. "You are under no obligation to re-engage," Reynolds said. "However, given recent events, Command believes clarity is required." "Clarity for whom?" Emily asked. "For this facility," Reynolds replied. "And for the people who attempted to override your judgment." Emily leaned back slightly. "You want to make an example?" Reynolds didn't deny it. "We want accountability." A familiar weight settled in Emily's chest, not fear, not reluctance, but responsibility. The kind that never truly left, no matter how far you walked from it. "What happens if I decline?" she asked. Reynolds met her gaze steadily. "Then we handle this quietly. Administratively. The hospital buries it. The people responsible keep their positions." Emily's eyes hardened. "And if I don't?" Reynolds' voice was calm. "Then we proceed openly." Emily closed her eyes briefly. She saw the patient's labored breathing, the hesitation in the attending's voice, the smug certainty in Harlan's expression when he thought protocol mattered more than life. She opened her eyes. "Proceed openly," she said. Reynolds nodded once. "As you wish." He stood and moved toward the door. "They're assembled." Emily rose to her feet. Outside, the corridor had filled. Doctors, nurses, administrators, security, everyone pretending not to stare, failing miserably. As the conference room door opened, conversation died instantly. Reynolds stepped aside. Emily walked out. Not quickly, not dramatically, just forward. Every step echoed. She stopped in the center of the corridor. Eyes locked onto her from every direction, confusion, curiosity, disbelief. At the far end, a group of uniformed figures stood at attention. One of them stepped forward. "Commander," he said clearly, voice carrying through the hall. Emily felt the air lock in place. "For the record," he continued, "we are ready to report." The hospital stood frozen, caught between who they thought she was and who she had always been. And the truth finally had nowhere left to hide. No one spoke. The corridor seemed to narrow, as if the walls themselves leaned in to witness what was unfolding. Doctors stood with charts forgotten in their hands. Nurses froze mid-step. Even the monitors beeping from nearby rooms felt muted, subdued by the weight of the moment. "Commander," the SEAL repeated, his voice steady, unmistakably respectful. Emily Carter did not respond immediately. She stood perfectly still, eyes forward, shoulders squared, not in defiance, not in performance, but in recognition. Recognition of a role she had never truly left behind, only set aside. Administrator Harlan's face had gone pale. His mouth opened, then closed again, as though his mind refused to assemble the words forming behind his eyes. Around him, the hospital staff exchanged glances, disbelief rippling outward like a shockwave. "Commander," a nurse whispered. "Did he just—" The whisper died unfinished. Emily exhaled once slowly. Then she turned. Her movement was subtle, but the effect was immediate. The SEALs straightened further, boots aligned, posture flawless. It wasn't showmanship. It was instinct. Years of training responding to something deeper than rank, a presence they recognized before they consciously named it. "At ease," Emily said. The words were quiet. They carried anyway. The SEALs obeyed instantly. Gasps flickered through the corridor, quickly stifled. Someone dropped a pen. It clattered against the floor, loud in the silence. Captain Reynolds stepped forward, his voice measured. "For clarity," he said, addressing the assembled staff, "Emily Carter is recognized by United States Naval Command as a former operational commander with active medical authority. Former operational commander." The words rearranged reality. Harlan found his voice at last. "This is a mistake," he said hoarsely. "She's a nurse. She works for Reynolds." Turned to him. "She worked here," he corrected. "Until this morning." Emily's gaze shifted to Harlan, not with triumph, not with anger, with something far more unsettling. "Pity." "You knew," Emily said softly. Harlan shook his head. "I didn't. You knew enough," she continued. "You knew I wasn't reckless. You knew I wasn't careless. You knew my decisions saved lives." Harlan swallowed hard. "You chose hierarchy over humanity," Emily said. "That was your call." The attending physician from the night shift stepped forward hesitantly. "Emily, I didn't realize." Emily looked at him. "You didn't ask." He flinched. Reynolds cleared his throat. "The patient removed from this facility earlier today is now stable. His survival is directly linked to Commander Carter's actions." A murmur spread through the crowd. Furthermore, Reynolds continued, "A preliminary review indicates repeated instances where hospital leadership discouraged appropriate emergency response to minimize administrative exposure." Harlan's breath hitched. "You can't prove that." Reynolds gestured subtly. Agent Collins stepped forward, holding a tablet. "Documentation," Collins said. "Time-stamped. Audio. Internal messages." Harlan staggered back a step. Emily didn't look at the tablet. She didn't need to. Reynolds turned back to the staff. "This review is ongoing. Until its conclusion, administrative authority at St. Mercy is suspended pending federal oversight." The words landed like a controlled detonation. Suspended. Oversight. Federal. Security personnel shifted into place, calm but unmistakable. Administrators exchanged panicked glances. Phones buzzed unanswered. Emily stepped forward again, drawing the room's attention back to her. "I didn't come here to expose anyone," she said. "I came here to work." Her voice was steady but not cold. "I chose this hospital because it treated people at their most vulnerable," she continued. "No rank, no uniform, no clearance levels, just need." She looked around the corridor at the nurses who had whispered, the residents who had laughed, the administrators who had dismissed her. "I never hid who I was," Emily said. "I simply didn't announce it." The junior nurse from earlier felt tears sting her eyes. Harlan shook his head weakly. "You let us think. I let you judge me by my actions," Emily replied. "You did." A long silence followed. Then one of the SEALs stepped forward, not the lead, not the one who had spoken earlier, but a younger operator. His voice was controlled, but emotion threaded beneath it. "Ma'am," he said, addressing Emily with respect, "you saved one of ours." Again, Emily met his eyes. "I saved a patient." The SEAL nodded. "Yes, ma'am." Reynolds glanced at Emily. "Command would like to formally reinstate your status." Emily considered the offer. The room seemed to hold its breath again, waiting for her answer. "No," she said. Reynolds blinked. "Commander, I'm not returning to the field," Emily said gently. "Not like that." Reynolds studied her for a long moment. Then he nodded. "Understood." But Emily continued, "I will finish what I started here." She turned to the staff. "This hospital can be better, but only if the people in it remember why they're here." Her gaze lingered on the nurses. "You matter," she said simply. "On the residents. Speak up. On the administrators. Listen." Reynolds stepped forward. "For the duration of this review, Commander Carter will serve as medical liaison. Emily accepted with a nod, not as a promotion, not as validation, but as responsibility. As the SEALs began to move, their presence no longer threatening but protective, the corridor slowly unfroze. Conversations resumed in hushed tones. Reality began to settle into its new shape. Harlan remained where he was staring at the floor. Emily approached him one last time. "You asked me once what I thought I was," she said quietly. He didn't look up. "I'm someone who doesn't walk away when it matters," Emily finished. She turned and walked down the corridor, past stunned faces, past whispered questions, past the life she'd lived quietly for years. Behind her, the hospital buzzed with the aftermath of truth. Ahead of her, the work remained. The hospital didn't return to normal after that. It tried. Lights brightened, announcements resumed, carts rolled down hallways, but something fundamental had shifted. People spoke more carefully. Decisions took longer. Eyes lingered on Emily Carter, with a mix of curiosity and recalibration, as if everyone were quietly rewriting their understanding of what authority looked like. Emily didn't linger in the corridor. She never did, when moments threatened to turn ceremonial. Instead, she walked with Captain Reynolds toward a smaller conference room near administration, one that had been rarely used, insulated from foot traffic, designed for conversations that were never meant to echo. Inside, Reynolds closed the door himself. "You handled that well," he said. Emily removed her jacket and draped it over the back of a chair. It didn't need handling. It needed honesty. Reynolds allowed a brief smile. "You've always had a way of making those feel the same." She sat, folding her hands on the table. "What comes next?" Reynolds leaned against the wall, arms crossed. "The review team will stay. Documentation will be audited. Interim leadership will be installed." And Harlan Reynolds exhaled slowly. "Administrative suspension pending investigation. The evidence is substantial." Emily nodded once. She felt no satisfaction, only the quiet relief that truth once surfaced rarely went back under without consequence. "There's something else," Reynolds said. "The operator you saved, Lieutenant Mark Hale." Emily's eyes flicked up. "He's stable." "Yes," Reynolds replied. "And conscious." A flicker of emotion passed through Emily's face, gone as quickly as it appeared. "Good. He asked for you," Reynolds added. Emily was silent for a moment. "I'm not cleared." "You are now." The ICU looked different when Emily returned. Not calmer exactly, but more attentive. Nurses moved with intention. Residents asked questions instead of assuming answers. When Emily stepped inside, no one tried to stop her. Mark Hale lay propped slightly upright, color returning to his face. Tubes still traced his body, but his breathing was stronger, steadier. When he saw Emily, his lips curved into a faint smile. "Figured they'd find you," he rasped. Emily stepped to his bedside. "You should be resting." "I am," he replied. "This is the good part." She checked his vitals, adjusted a monitor setting, then met his eyes. "You caused quite a disruption." He chuckled softly. "You always did." Emily's brow furrowed. "We've met." "In passing," he said. "Different base, different time. You wouldn't remember." She considered him, then nodded. "Probably not." He grew serious. "They told me what happened after I went under." Emily said nothing. "You didn't have to stay," he continued. "You didn't have to push." "I did," Emily replied simply. Hale studied her. "You always push." She met his gaze, unflinching. "People live when someone does." A quiet settled between them, filled only by the rhythm of machines. "I owe you my life," Hale said. Emily shook her head. "You were already alive. I just refused to let anyone forget that." When she left the ICU, the hallway felt narrower, crowded, not with people but with expectation. Word had traveled fast. Nurses nodded as she passed. A resident straightened unconsciously. Even security guards acknowledged her presence with a respect that hadn't been there before. Emily didn't acknowledge any of it. Back in administration, Agent Collins met her with a tablet tucked under his arm. "We're compiling formal statements," he said. "Your testimony will be central." Emily stopped walking. "I don't want it to be." Collins hesitated. "With respect, it already is." She considered. "Then, keep it factual. No embellishment." "That's your style," Collins said quietly. In a closed meeting room, interim administrators gathered faces, unfamiliar voices measured. Emily laid out events chronologically. No accusations, no emotional framing. Just decisions, outcomes, consequences. When she finished, one of the interim leaders spoke. "You could have escalated sooner." Emily nodded. Yes. Why didn't you? Because escalation can become noise, Emily replied. And noise gets tuned out. I wanted action. Another administrator leaned forward. You let them believe you were powerless. Emily met his gaze. I let them reveal how they treat people they think are. Silence followed. The meeting adjourned without applause, without resolution. That would come later. Accountability took time. But momentum had shifted and everyone in the room felt it. As evening fell, Emily found herself alone in the staff lounge. The same room where she'd once sat, unnoticed, coffee untouched. She poured a fresh cup and actually drank it this time. The junior nurse from before hovered in the doorway. Emily, she asked softly. Yes, the nurse stepped inside. I wanted to say, thank you. Emily tilted her head slightly. For what? For not making us feel small, the nurse replied. When you could have. Emily considered the words. You were never small. The nurse swallowed. I want to be like you. Emily shook her head gently. Be better. Ask questions. Speak when it matters. The nurse nodded, eyes shining. I will. When the lounge emptied again, Emily checked her phone. One new message. Command acknowledges closure. She typed back a single response. Acknowledged. Outside, the storm had finally passed. The city glowed under wet streets and evening light. Emily stepped onto the hospital's front steps and breathed in the cool air. She had never wanted recognition. She had never chased authority. But when silence failed to protect the right thing, she had stepped into the space where truth demanded a voice. Behind her, St. Mercy continued to adjust to a new reality, one where decisions were questioned, where titles mattered less than courage, where a quiet nurse had reminded everyone what service really looked like. And Emily Carter walked forward not as a commander, not as a symbol, but as someone who stayed when it counted. The first real consequences arrived quietly. No press releases, no public statements, just changes subtle at first, then impossible to ignore. Offices once occupied were suddenly locked. Access codes stopped working. Names disappeared from email threads and meeting invites as if they had never been there at all. Emily Carter noticed everything even as she pretended not to. She moved through St. Mercy Regional Hospital with the same steady pace she always had, though now her presence changed the air around her. Conversations shifted when she entered rooms not with fear but with attention. People listened more closely. They asked questions before issuing orders. The hierarchy hadn't vanished, but it had softened, restructured around accountability rather than assumption. Interim leadership moved quickly. Audits began. Protocols were reviewed line by line. The phrase, "that's how we've always done it," stopped ending discussions. Administrator Richard Harlan had not returned. Emily hadn't asked where he was. She was in the ER that evening, not officially on shift, not in scrubs, but observing. The department was busy but controlled. A multi-vehicle accident had flooded triage, and the charge nurse looked overwhelmed. Emily stepped beside her quietly. "Start with airway and circulation," Emily said. "Delegate documentation. You don't need to carry everything." The nurse exhaled, nodding. "Right." Emily didn't take over. She never did. She simply recalibrated the space and stepped back, letting others rise to it. Later, Agent Collins met her near the ambulance bay. "We've completed the initial findings," he said. "Would you like a summary?" Emily hesitated. "Only if it affects patient care." "It does," Collins replied. "Several systemic failures were identified. Leadership interference, suppressed incident reports." Emily's jaw tightened. And formal action has been recommended." She nodded once. "Good." Collins studied her. "You're not curious who's being held responsible." Emily met his gaze. "Curiosity doesn't change outcomes. Follow-through does." He gave a small, respectful smile. "You haven't changed." "No," Emily agreed. "I just stopped hiding." That night, she returned home later than planned. The apartment felt smaller after days spent navigating corridors heavy with consequence. She cooked a simple meal, ate standing at the counter, then sat on the couch without turning on the television. Her phone buzzed. "An unfamiliar number," she answered. "Carter." Emily came a familiar voice. "Captain Reynolds." "Yes. We've concluded our involvement here," Reynolds said. "The hospital will remain under review, but Command's role is complete. I expected as much. There's one more thing," he added. "Harlan has requested to speak with you." Emily closed her eyes briefly. Why? He believes you're the only one who will listen. Silence stretched between them. Tell him no, Emily said finally. Reynolds hesitated. Understood. After the call ended, Emily sat for a long moment, listening to the quiet. She felt no triumph, no satisfaction. Justice rarely came with applause. It came with weight. The next morning, Emily returned to St. Mercy. Not summoned, not required, but needed. A nurse met her near the entrance, eyes wide. "They're reinstating you," she said breathlessly. With commendation. Emily paused. "On whose authority, Federal Liaison and Interim Board?" the nurse replied. "They said I'll hear it when it's formal," Emily said gently. Inside, the atmosphere buzzed with restrained energy. Staff whispered in clusters. Some smiled when they saw her. Others looked away, unsure how to approach her, now that the illusion of familiarity had cracked. In a small conference room, the interim director, a woman named Dr. Elaine Morris, waited. "We'd like you to return to your position," Dr. Morris said, with expanded authority. Emily folded her hands. "I don't want authority." Dr. Morris nodded. "Then take influence." Emily considered. "On what terms? Patient-first protocol," Dr. Morris replied. "Protected escalation, transparent reporting, no retaliation." Emily nodded slowly. Then, yes, the agreement was signed without ceremony. Emily returned to the ER that night in scrubs once more, her badge clipped where it had always been. There was no announcement, no acknowledgement beyond nods and quiet hellos. And that was exactly how she wanted it. A trauma call came in just before midnight. Emily moved, automatically, seamlessly, part of a team that functioned better now because it had learned to listen. At one point, a resident hesitated over a decision. "What do you think?" he asked Emily. She met his eyes. "I think you already know." He nodded and acted. Afterward, as the patient stabilized, the resident approached her again. "Thank you," he said. "For what?" Emily asked. "For trusting me," he replied. Emily smiled faintly. "Earn it, every time." Near the end of her shift, Emily passed the administrative wing. One office remained dark, untouched. A nameplate had been removed, leaving only faint outlines where screws once held it in place. She didn't stop. Outside dawn crept over the horizon, softening the edges of the city. Emily stepped into the cool air and breathed deeply. She felt tired but grounded. The kind of tired that came from standing your ground rather than being pushed from it. Her phone buzzed once more. A final message from Reynolds. "Command notes, justice served." Emily typed back. "Patients first. Always." She slipped the phone into her pocket and headed home, knowing the hospital behind her would never quite be the same. Not because of who she was, but because of what she refused to ignore. The hospital settled into a new rhythm, not louder, not softer, but more deliberate. Emily Carter felt it during the small moments most people overlooked. A resident pausing before dismissing a nurse's concern. A charge nurse documenting an incident instead of smoothing it over. An administrator asking a question and waiting for the answer even when it complicated the schedule. Change, Emily knew, rarely announced itself. It seeped in. She returned fully to her night shifts by choice. No special title, no office. Just the ER where decisions mattered most, when no one was watching. The interim board had offered her broader authority again, policy oversight liaison roles, but she declined most of it. "I'll consult when asked," she'd said. "I won't hover." Dr. Elaine Morris understood. "Influence," she replied. "Not command." Exactly. One night, an elderly woman arrived in respiratory distress. The room filled quickly, respiratory therapy, a resident, a nurse, fumbling with equipment. The resident's voice trembled as he called for orders. Emily stepped in, not in front, not over anyone's shoulder, but beside the resident. "Slow your breathing," she said quietly. "You're okay. Start with the basics." He nodded, steadied himself, and acted. The patient stabilized within minutes. When it was over, the resident looked at Emily, eyes wide with relief. "You didn't take over." Emily removed her gloves. "You didn't need me to." He swallowed. "Thank you." Emily nodded once and moved on. In the break room later, she overheard two nurses talking in hushed voices. "I heard she turned down a command role," one said. "Why would anyone do that?" the other asked. Emily poured coffee without interrupting. "Because she already knows who she is," the first nurse answered after a beat. Emily allowed herself a small smile. Not everything had smoothed over. Accountability had teeth. A few staff members resigned quietly. Others were reassigned. Training sessions were mandatory now on escalation, documentation, patient advocacy. Some complained. Some adapted. Some did both. Emily kept her focus narrow. Patients, teams, the space between decisions and outcomes. One evening near the end of her shift, she received a message to stop by the ICU. No urgency flagged, just a note, patient requesting you by name. She paused at the threshold, recognizing the pattern. Mark Hale looked stronger when she entered, color returned, shoulders less tense, eyes clearer. He smiled when he saw her. "Thought you'd avoid this," he said. Emily checked the monitor out of habit. "I considered it." "Fair," he replied. "I won't keep you long." She pulled a chair closer and sat. "You shouldn't talk too much, I know," he said. "That's why I'll get to the point." She waited. "They told me what happened after I left," Hale continued. "About the hospital. About the review." Emily said nothing. "You could have walked away," he said. "No one would have blamed you." Emily met his eyes. "Someone always pays when people walk away." He nodded slowly. "I'm glad it wasn't you." A silence settled, comfortable, unforced. "Are you going back out there?" Emily asked finally. Hale considered. "Eventually." She nodded. "Be careful." He smiled faintly. "That's your line." When she stood to leave, he spoke again. "For what it's worth, the team asked about you." Emily stopped, "And they wanted to know if you'd ever come back." Emily shook her head gently. "Tell them I already am. Just somewhere else." He understood. As she left the ICU, she passed a junior nurse struggling to comfort a patient's family. The mother's hands shook. The father stared at the floor, rigid with fear. Emily stepped in, lowered herself to their level, and spoke quietly. No promises, no jargon, just clarity and presence. The mother's shoulders eased. The father looked up. Afterward, the nurse exhaled. "I didn't know what to say." Emily squeezed her shoulder. "You didn't have to say much. You had to stay." Near the end of the shift, Emily found herself alone at the nurse's station, finishing documentation. The hum of machines, the soft shuffle of footsteps, it all felt familiar again. Grounded. A security guard approached hesitantly. "Miss Carter," Emily looked up. "Yes, I just wanted to say, things feel different now," he said. "Better." Emily closed the chart. "Different isn't permanent." He nodded. "But it's a start." "It is," she agreed. As dawn approached, the ER quieted. Emily clocked out and changed, folding her scrubs with the same care she always had. She clipped her badge back on, not because she needed to, but because it belonged there. In the hallway, she passed the dark administrative office again. The nameplate was gone for good now. The space looked smaller without the certainty that had once filled it. Outside, the sky softened into pale blues and golds. Emily stood for a moment on the front steps, breathing in the morning air. She thought about the night the rotors shook the roof. The moment silence turned heavy. The choice she'd made to proceed openly. She hadn't done it for recognition. She hadn't done it for vindication. She'd done it because someone had needed her to stay. Behind her, St. Mercy hummed awake, imperfect learning trying. Emily turned and walked home, carrying the quiet knowledge that while power could arrive loudly, respect often grew in silence. And silence, when held with integrity, could still change everything. The night Emily Carter realized things had truly changed, there was no crisis to mark it. No alarms. No rushing gurneys. No raised voices cutting through the ER. It was an ordinary shift, one of those deceptively calm nights when the hospital seemed to breathe in unison, waiting. Emily moved through triage with her clipboard, checking vitals, exchanging quiet updates with nurses who no longer spoke over one another. A middle-aged man sat hunched on a stretcher, clutching his side, pain etched deep into his face. A resident stood nearby, uncertain, flipping through the chart. "What do you think?" the resident asked Emily, not deferentially but respectfully. Emily studied the patient, the subtle tension in his shoulders, the way he guarded one side when he breathed. "Let's rule out internal bleeding," she said. "Start imaging now." The resident nodded without hesitation. On it. Emily watched him move, confident, decisive, and felt a quiet satisfaction that had nothing to do with credit. Later, as she restocked supplies, the junior nurse approached her again. Her movements were steadier now, her voice firmer. "I spoke up today," the nurse said. Emily looked at her. "About what?" "A medication dosage." The resident brushed it off at first, but I pushed. She hesitated, then smiled. "I was right." Emily nodded. Good. I was scared, the nurse admitted. Emily met her gaze. Being scared doesn't disqualify you. Staying silent does. The nurse absorbed that, then straightened. Thank you. As the night wore on, Emily found herself thinking less about what had happened and more about what remained. Justice had been addressed, but it wasn't finished. It never was. It lived in the small daily choices, the ones no helicopter ever announced. Near the end of the shift, Emily received a call from Dr. Morris. Emily, she said, the board finalized its decision. Emily leaned against the counter. And permanent removal of the previous administrative structure, Dr. Morris replied. New leadership standards. Federal compliance oversight for the next 18 months. Emily exhaled slowly. That should help. It will, Dr. Morris said. But it wouldn't have happened without you. Emily was quiet for a moment. It would have happened with anyone willing to stay. Doctor. Morris smiled on the other end of the line. You should know your name came up again. Emily raised an eyebrow. It tends to. There are people who still want you back, Dr. Morris continued. In higher places. Emily's gaze drifted toward the ER floor, toward nurses moving with purpose, toward residents learning to trust their instincts, toward patients who didn't know how close they'd come to being overlooked. Tell them I'm where I belong, Emily said. After the call ended, she finished her charting and clocked out. The familiar ritual grounded her. Badge off. Scrubs folded. Locker closed. In the hallway, she paused. The hospital was quiet, truly quiet. The kind of quiet that didn't feel oppressive but earned. Emily walked toward the exit, her footsteps soft against the floor. At the doors, she stopped and turned back once, taking in the space that had tested her more than any battlefield ever had. Here, the enemy hadn't been chaos or violence. It had been complacency. Outside, the night air was cool and clear. No storm clouds. No rotors in the sky, just the city humming in the distance, unaware of how close it had come to losing something irreplaceable. Emily stood for a moment, hands in her jacket pockets, and allowed herself a rare pause. She thought about the path she'd chosen, the uniform she'd set aside, the silence she'd embraced, the moments when being underestimated had been both shield and burden. She had learned long ago that leadership wasn't about being seen. It was about being there when the cost was real. Inside the hospital, a patient laughed softly at something a nurse said. A monitor beeped, steady and reassuring. Life continued. Emily turned and walked away from St. Mercy Regional Hospital, not elevated, not diminished, just understood. And that, she knew, was enough. Some of the most important decisions in life happen when no one is watching. Emily Carter was underestimated not because she lacked ability, but because she chose humility over recognition. She didn't announce her past. She didn't demand respect. She let her actions speak in rooms where silence was more powerful than noise. This story isn't about rank uniforms or authority. It's about moral courage, the kind that shows up quietly, does the right thing, and accepts the consequences without needing applause. It's about staying when it would be easier to walk away. About speaking when silence becomes complicity. True leadership isn't loud. It doesn't arrive with fanfare. Often it's mistaken for weakness until the moment it becomes indispensable. If this story moved you, share where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. And if you believe stories like this matter, stories about integrity, justice, and quiet strength, consider subscribing so we can keep telling them together.